Hello, SQL people, DBAs, data professionals, data analysts out there. Welcome to Scottish Summit. As data platforms and data processes or operations are getting more complex, I think our technique or our approach can be more effective. In fact, today I'm going to talk exactly that using Jupyter Notebooks or Notebooks 101 for SQL people. My name is Koesmarno. I am a program manager at Microsoft. Let's first thank our sponsors. You can also find me on Twitter. I am at MSSQLGirl or Miss SQL Girl. And you'll hear some more tips and tricks on Jupyter Notebooks or Azure Data Studio or KQL from there. All right, let's get started. So here's our learning journey today. First of all, what is notebooks and why do we care about notebooks? And then we'll talk about how if you are using SQL scripts today or PowerShell scripts, how can we convert them to notebooks before or to help you get started with your notebooks journey. And lastly, we're going to wrap up with all the wonderful resources that are already available out there. Some are from Microsoft and some are actually from SQL community like yourself. All right, let's get started with notebooks. Now, in this specific demo, I'm actually going to use Azure Data Studio, but the main concept you can also apply to the vanilla Jupyter Notebooks as well. Now, I prefer Azure Data Studio, not only because I'm actually coming from the team, but also the fact that Azure Data Studio supports quite a lot of modern data experiences. And we'll get more to that later today. Okay, here is my Azure Data Studio window where I can start creating a new notebook. So simply from the Welcome Azure Data Studio page here, I can go to New and then click on the New Notebook and voila, this is a blank canvas. Now there are two things to bear in mind when you are using notebooks, because it is slightly different from scripts. You know, when you use scripts, you simply type in your SQL statement as an example and then run it and you'll get results. Now in notebooks, there are two types of things that you can work with. The first one is a text cell and the other one is code cells. And you can have as many of these as much as you want, as long as it makes sense to what you're trying to do. So let's first get started with creating a text cell. So from here, I can click on the plus text, but I can also go from the top here, plus cell, and then choose text cell. Currently, I'm actually in the split view. So this is because I'm more familiar with the markdown text, so that's why I'm starting with the split view. But I could also change it to the WYSIWYG mode or the rich text view. So this is where you can start typing a lot of, free form kind of text essentially. So let's type in the hello world. And now I can start changing this to heading 1 as an example, and then start typing in, this is Scottish Summit, right? And if you want to, you can actually also add an emoji as an example like that. And that's it, that's a text cell. So here, usually if you are coming from, say, data analyst sort of world, this is probably an area where you can kind of provide an introduction to what the analysis is about and maybe provide executive summary, etc. And we'll give you an example on that later. Now, I'm going to just simply create a code cell. So in code cell, as it suggests, you can start typing in code. Now, if you're wondering what kind of code can I write, there are multiple languages supported in Azure Data Studio. So from here on the top, I have a list of kernel that I can connect to. So essentially, that's the list of languages that I can write. So for example, SQL, for KQL or query language, and also Python, PowerShell, etc. So I'm going to just start gentle with SQL. So let's now do select top 10 star from sys.objects. Now, obviously, when you run this, it's not going to be able to execute. It just knows that you've selected the SQL language, so it comes with the IntelliSense and everything else, or syntax highlight. So it's super useful. But if you want to run this, you'll need to make sure that you are connected to a database server or database connection. Now, you can choose from SQL Server or Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then get started with it. So let me change the connection to a SQL Server one. So let me pop in the details here and then start connecting. All right, looks like I'm connected, so I can start running it. And let's take a look. It looks like there are 10 rows returned and lots of columns, and you can scroll to the right, etc., to see the values. Now, the cool thing about this is that notebook file or notebook file underneath is just a JSON file, but it's rendered in the client tool, for example, this Azure Data Studio, in a nicer kind of way, easy to consume for human. The trick here is that if you save a notebook file like this as an example and then share it with another person, they'll be able to see not only the text cells but also the code cells, which means they also can see the result set. So for example, this. So if I exactly, save this one and share it with you, you will be able to see all the rows here as well. Now, something to be mindful for is that if you have some sensitive data inside the result set, you may want to clear it. So to do that, you click on the ellipsis and then change or choose the clear result like this. You could also clear, if you have multiple cells, that is, or code cells, you could also clear results from the button on the top there. All right, and yeah, let's create another text cell as an example. And then this time around, I'm actually going to use Markdown because that's something that I'm actually quite familiar with. And I can start typing in something like my second query. And then I'll say, let's take a look at version, right? So from here, I'm going to add a new code cell and then say select add version. So obviously it's not liking it, so I'm going to fix it. So that's really good that it has the IntelliSense, right? To be able to correct my my SQL statement. So now I'm going to click run, and it's going to show me that it is using, or my version is SQL Server 2019. I'm using the RTMCU9, so very handy. And I can run the top one again, and then I will retain the results, right? So the order of execution, if you execute individually, it's up to you. You can execute the second cell, third cell, etc., or code cells, yeah, and then go back up. But if you want to clear all the results, you can click on this. And if you say decide to run all, it will always execute it in from the top to the bottom, like this. Now that's a quick demo on a SQL notebook. Obviously, you can also start playing around with the PowerShell kernel, which I will show you a little bit later as well today. Now that you've seen notebooks in Azure Data Studio, you're probably wondering, how did it all get started and why is it, useful for me? So here goes the story. So a business person actually came to me and asked, hey, I need to know which product has the fastest turnaround. And I would reply as a data analyst, I'd say, hey, let me query that. I know how to do this. And I started typing in select top 10 stuff from production.product, etc. And, just trying to figure out, what are the columns inside that table before I start typing the query that is more relevant to the first question, which is the product that has the fastest turnaround. So with my definition of, well, I guess anything that's less than 4 days would be a fast turnaround. So let me just query that and then save the output to Excel and then share it to the business person. And then they'll eventually come around and then say, oh, actually, you know what? I need a product category. I'm like, okay, well, I can do that. So let me add a brand new, or add a bit more details, and then I start typing in more select statement and lots of joins, and then fancy stuff, right? And then I'll also send the Excel spreadsheet to the person again, and then they'll say, hey, this is for the last quarter, right? And I go, well, in my previous query, I actually didn't really use the sales data. Now I have to use it. How do I think about this? You mean like sold product? So let me just try giving it a go again. So here's my kind of third attempt, a little bit longer query and more joins, and then, send it back to them. All right, so they're happy. I've sent the Excel spreadsheet. I've got my SQL script saved somewhere, and they're happy. So they sent me a kudos, I'm a rock star, yay. So in the back end, this is actually what it looks like. These are all my SQL scripts in the closet. So I've got lots of, select statements that I was trying to figure out what the database looks like or what the tables look like, and then which tables to use, and then figuring out how to write the right things for the right queries for to answer the business questions. And many days later, the business user came back and said, hey, that list that you sent me last time about the fast manufacturer, can I have a refresh of it, please? And I'd go, it's been a while, so what sort of list? It took me a while to realize, oh, yeah, that's the list. A little bit panicky here. And then eventually I find the script, but I'm actually panicking, because they also asking a lot more questions like, hey, I want to compare with the results back then and now. Have you got any changes to the script because the results not quite what I'm expecting? Was logic the same? So there were a bunch of questions which leads to more and more panic. Now, it is kind of scary, isn't it? When you think about it, are you playing Jenga with your SQL scripts where you have a bunch of scripts stacked together and you never know which one's the right one, etc.? When scripts and output are separated, we see these challenges, which essentially are barriers to collaborate. As an example, if I were to only share with you the output, you might not be able to reproduce it again or reuse anything out of that for the next time. And if I were to share with you some scripts, you might be able to do some kind of code review, but while the code may be right, but it might not provide the intended output because you might be missing context. And especially in the troubleshooting scenario or incident response scenario, it may be pretty hard to audit the exact steps that were done for the incident to resolve the incidents if you don't have a good sort of layout of these are the steps of the code as well as the outcome or the output that happened at the time of mitigation. Now, if you have a lot of knowledge base and siloed scripts or maybe wiki, sometimes it also becoming a barrier to do a lot of copying and pasting from the wiki to the client tooling. So it's not so executable and it's not so discoverable. And this is where Notebook comes in handy. Not only it comes with documentation, or it has the documentation aspect, the text cell that I showed you earlier. It can contain code, so you can write code cells and it's executable. You can save the results if you wish to. And you can also add, as part of the text cells, the analysis, the interpretation. And on top of that, you can also add visualization. So earlier, I only showed you the table results. I didn't show you the visualization, but I'll demo that very shortly. But yeah, all of these packaged in Notebooks. When you really think about it, a lot of the things that we do as SQL people are actually a lot of scientific work or science work, right? We first come up with hypotheses. For example, when we're troubleshooting, come up with hypotheses, what is kind of not quite right, and what are the methods that we think can identify the symptoms, what are the rough processes that we want to take when we want to mitigate the issues. So it's actually very scientific. And this is one of the reasons why Notebooks is great, because Notebook was originally first intended for data scientists, very sciencey work. And turns out that a lot of our work as well in the SQL world is also, or can be considered as science work. All right, we talked a little bit about Jupyter Notebook earlier, and I wanted to share a couple of things here just to kind of reorient you to what is available out there. So Jupyter Notebook, first of all, is an open source format. There are quite a few client viewers out there that can view Jupyter Notebooks. And there are also client tools out there that can also support the execution side of it. So like, for example, Azure Data Studio or VS Code, they both support the viewing as well as the execution side of it. Whereas if you upload a notebook file on GitHub, it's mostly on the viewing side. Or if you want to also upload a notebook in Azure DevOps, there is also an extension which is called Jupyter Notebook Preview, if I remember correctly, or Azure DevOps Jupyter Preview. And that's where you can also view the notebooks, but you won't be able to execute it. So it's great for just sharing documentation, but you really want to have that access to the client tool like Azure Data Studio VS Code to really get a full advantage of Jupyter Notebook. Okay, so I'm going to jump into another demo very shortly, but before that, I want to set the stage a little bit for Azure Data Studio and why Azure Data Studio is a preferred notebook client tool. First of all, Azure Data Studio provides modern data experiences. That means it is cross-platform. It's a cross-platform client tool, so you can run Azure Data Studio on Windows, macOS, Linux. It supports Git. So if you have scripts like KQL, PowerShell, or SQL scripts, and you want to add it to source control to better, track changes and share with others, especially if you are publishing it to GitHub, it allows other people in the community to also comment and improve that if you make it public, right? And it supports a lot of different kernels for notebooks, as you saw earlier. So there's a support for SQL, PowerShell. Those are probably the top two that you would really enjoy using. And there's also KQL, Custo support, and also Python. Azure Data Studio supports extensible framework as well. What that means is if there is another person in the community who decides that they want to customize an experience for notebooks or otherwise, say for example, Postgres, you can install the Postgres extension. And most of all, Azure Data Studio is open source. And it is a fork of VS Code, which means if you're already coming from VS Code world, using Azure Data Studio must be super easy. Regardless, Azure Data Studio is actually pretty easy to get started with. Okay, now that I have shown you or talked about Azure Data Studio, let's dive into other examples of Azure Data Studio notebooks or notebooks in Azure Data Studio. Okay, so let's first get started with this reproducible research example. Now this one here is actually prepared, so I'm just loading it from a file that I've already created before, or a notebook that I've created before, and I happen to pin it here in the notebooks view-let, mostly because I know that I'm going to demo this and it's easier to access to that, so that's why I've pinned it first. Okay, let me just minimize this. So this is the notebook view-let to get a bit more real estate so I can demo it to you. Now, take notice here that my kernel is set to SQL, but I haven't attached it to any database, and I've just opened the file. Now from here, I can see that this is a marketing experimentation analysis notebook. So essentially it's a bit like a paper for data analysis. I've provided some abstract and an introduction. So this is super useful when you're trying to do some kind of data analysis that you want to share with others, and you might actually have to refer back to it. Over here, I'm actually documenting how I'm connecting to the Wide World Importers database, which is super handy if in case somebody wants to reuse the notebook. And then over here, if I scroll down a little bit, it shows me that the first thing that I'm trying to do here is select the top 10 rows from tables that we'll be using today. And it's actually collapsed. So the script is collapsed, so it makes it a little bit easy to consume when you are simply, viewing it and not having to review the code. So you can just, especially for business users, if you share this notebook, they can read the text above to understand the context, and then they can also see the result set, which is super handy. But if I'm coming from the, another data analyst who wants to reuse this notebook, I could also expand it just to understand, hey, how did you write that select statement, or what did the code look like before? Okay, so again, this file was just reopened. I didn't have to run anything, and it actually stored the result set. Now, if you are doing a lot of, or if you do a lot of presentation for other people or demo, Notebook is really useful for that. In fact, I've seen a lot of people in the SQL community that love using notebooks when they are trying to demo something, because it gives them a way of reproducing the demo during the demo. and if they happen to share it with other people, like the attendees can follow it afterwards as well. Which reminds me, this notebook here is actually available as well from GitHub, and I will share with you the link to access this notebook. So now let me just scroll a little bit more, and the next few steps are to do with analyzing the unique stock items. And then step 2 here is, talking about identifying product group 1. And then the next one is identifying the product group 2. So because it's a marketing experiment, they want to do a little bit of A/B testing. That's why we identify product group 1 and product group 2. And if I scroll all the way down, which actually shows the conclusion, as you can see here, there is an image. Well, not image, there's a chart. So that you can also save as image. So these charts actually created using a select statement. And and then the chart is, you can configure it, and you can also view the table again. Let me just update the column width a little bit, that way it's easier to read. And I can go back to chart, and it will view the chart. So if you're already using SQL queries today in Azure Data Studio, the controls that we have on top here is no different from what you have on SQL queries today, which is you are able to save the output as CSV. So the tabular output as CSV, you can export it to Excel, you can export it as JSON, or you can export it as XML, and obviously, visualizing it as chart or tables. So very, very handy. And this is one of the reasons why when I did a lot of data analysis back, a couple of years ago, using Notebook is very appealing to me because of this whole idea of I can write the paper for the business, as in like the analysis, and I can include the code and the methodology that I use for the analysis as part of the paper. Now, you're probably wondering, hey, Julia has talked a lot about that analysis. What is the DBA world look like then with notebooks? All right, let's dive into that. Okay, so from here, I've actually pinned other notebooks as well, which is this troubleshooting guide template. So this is to give you a bit of an example of what you can use, or how you can organize your troubleshooting guides into something a bit more structured and easily shareable with other people. So first we get started with the troubleshooting guide title. So you might want to call it identifying, maybe a low disk issue. And then from here you can start going to the different kind of overview, the symptoms, how to identify the symptoms, and how to mitigate it, and then the kinds of like next steps, for example, communications and everything else that you need to send out to other people when there is a low disk issue. So let me jump to the overview here, so that nicely scrolls down to the overview section. And then you can provide the symptoms, and then this is a template for you to provide the code on how to identify the symptoms. Remember that you can also use PowerShell if you'd like. And then these are the steps for mitigation step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, etc. And then again, you can use SQL PowerShell here as part of the steps, and then provide a verification area, so to make sure that the mitigation actually did take place and it was successful. And then after that, communicating with the users. So this is a fairly basic, straightforward troubleshooting guide template that you can use for your work today. And I know some of you are probably asking, Julie, you mentioned about SQL code and PowerShell code in the same notebook. Does Azure Data Studio support this multi-kernels concept? Well, technically it does. So you can start writing a PowerShell code on the first cell as an example, and then SQL code on the second code cell as an example. And if you run them individually, just need to make sure that you know or you remember to change the kernel and then start, running it one by one. So if you decide to write multiple languages in the same notebook, you won't be able to run all. So that's just one of the drawback. If you are familiar with Python as an example, and you want to write SQL as well as KQL, it is possible to do that. And we also support .NET Interactive as well. It's a little bit in the preview sort of mode, but in the .NET Interactive, you can choose to write C# as well as PowerShell. And I'm sure, when time comes, we hopefully can support more and more languages. And that way it makes, our life as DBAs or as data analysts who might be using multiple different kind of languages much easier to write notebooks. All right, some of you are probably thinking, I want to learn a little bit about Markdown, or I know a little bit about Markdown, but how different is it from the Markdown that is supported in Azure Data Studio? So let me share the cheat sheet that I've created earlier. It's actually pretty handy, and this is how I got started with Markdown. Again, this is a good path if you decide to use Markdown, but the rich text view is also available. So check out both ways, and you might sometimes need to combine both ways to create a really nice notebook. By and large, most of the time whenever I create a notebook, it's usually using a Markdown. So these are the different kind of formatting that Azure Data Studio support. So what I have here is a sample SQL script. In fact, it is to check best practices on SQL Server. I took it down from the GitHub from Microsoft Tiger Toolbox. Now, at the moment, it's only a SQL script. And say I want to convert this to a notebook. Now, it's going to be a lot of copying and pasting to a notebook, which is kind of not ideal. Now, what if there is a way of converting this to a notebook? So, in fact, there is. As you can see on the top here, there is a button called Export as Notebook. So if I click on that, it is going to launch a new notebook and convert the SQL script from earlier to a notebook. Now, one thing to bear in mind here, because SQL statement or SQL actually works kind of like in a batch mode. You need to kind of take into account that if you have the go statement in the script, then it is going to break it up into a few different sort of code cells, which is quite nice. But if you don't have any go statements, or you don't and you don't have much of in terms of comments, then the notebook output might be a little bit basic. So, but at the very least, you can from the notebook that you've converted, you can start enhancing it. For example, adding a new text cell, especially if you want to share it with the other people, maybe as part of the like an onboarding guide for a new team member. You can start typing in, say something like check best practices, and that's it, right? So very, very handy. Now, some of you are wondering, hey, what happens if I do have a lot of SQL scripts, or I have a lot of PowerShell scripts that I want to start converting? Well, the good news is Doug Vink, Microsoft MVP from PowerShell, he has created a PowerShell notebook module. And in that, it supports a number of commandlets, including convert to SQL notebook, as well as convert to PowerShell notebook. All right, check this out. Okay, so what I have here on the screen, I am actually using the .NET Interactive PowerShell. So instead of using the PowerShell kernel, I use .NET Interactive just because I happen to have it installed. By the way, if you love .NET Interactive, you might actually want to reach out to reproducible as well. So someone who's actually prominent in the SQL community who actually uses .NET Interactive quite a bit. All right, so let's get started with using the PowerShell Notebook module. All right, so to make sure that I do have the PowerShell Notebook module, I'm actually just gonna run a PowerShell script with the get module is available, where name like notebook. All right, it looks like I do have it already installed, and the version that I'm using is 2.6.16, so that's great. All right, so if I do decide I want to convert one of the files, which is the create collection job, and then converting it to IPYNB, I can simply run this and it will just convert one file or just that one file. So let me take a look at here. So voila, the IPYNB file just got created. So if I open it here, I should be able to see the notebook file that just got converted. And then now I'm going to run convert to PowerShell Notebook commandlet. So for this, I'm actually converting the PS1 file to IPYNB. Right, so now that we've got the basics of converting one file at a time using the PowerShell Notebook module or commandlet, so you know the convert to commandlets, now we can convert the SQL files in bulk. For example, like this. I just use the for each loop and then just go through all the directories, folders, and then just do that, run it, and make sure that it is in the loop I'm actually calling the convert to SQL notebook. And likewise for the PowerShell one, I'll do the same thing, but this one only convert the PS1 files to notebooks. And now I'm ready to verify that the conversions are already done. So if I do the get child item again, but I just filter on the IPYNB files, now I do get all the IPYNB files. So very, very handy. So just to recap what I've demoed to you, this is the single conversions way that you can do from Azure Data Studio, export as notebook or export notebook as SQL script, and you can also do PowerShell conversions as well as SQL conversions in bulk using the PowerShell Notebook module. Right, you're probably wondering, are there lots of notebook examples out there from the SQL community? And the answer is yes. So there is Tiger Toolbox notebooks. So the SQL Assessment Toolkit, the SQL Hybrid Toolkit, and the SQL Server 2019 Big Data Clusters, troubleshooting guides also written in notebooks, Glenberry's Diagnostic Notebooks for SQL Server, as well as for Azure SQL DB. They are also available in SQL scripts as well as the notebook ones, so very handy. And there's also Rob Sewell's PowerShell, .NET and not .NET notebooks that are also available from his website or from his GitHub as listed on the screen here. And there's also SQL Diagnostic Jupyter Notebook, Azure Data Studio extension that you can also install in Azure Data Studio to easily launch SQL Server 2019 or SQL Server Diagnostic Book. All right, with that, I'm going to jump to a quick example on some of this. Okay, I'm starting with a fresh Azure Data Studio window here. As you can see, my notebooks viewer is not filled with anything. I haven't opened any notebooks before or folders with notebooks, so it's pretty blank slate. Now, say if I'm actually working with SQL Server 2019 Big Data Clusters and I want to know how to troubleshoot. So one of the ways to do this is actually going to Control-Shift-P, which actually will launch the command palette. And from here, you can start launch this Jupyter Book SQL Server 2019 guide. So if I click on that, it will launch the provided books like this. Whoop, let me just drag it properly. There you go. And you get to see a lot of troubleshooting guides. And so, for example, from the Big Data Cluster Troubleshooter, you can click on this to navigate, to check on the version information, etc. It's actually a bit collapsed right now, so so you can collapse all and expand it and collapse again. So there we go. So this one here happens to use Python. which is actually quite powerful for this scenario. Let me show you another example of a great collection of notebooks for SQL Server, especially for the DBAs out there. And in fact, this specific notebook collection is organized in a Jupyter Book. To do that, I simply go to the extension marketplace, and this is actually how to get to the SQL Server Diagnostic Book created by Emmanuel Meso. So I go to the extension viewer, and then I'll start typing in, if I remember correctly, it's called SQL Server Diagnostic Book. There you go, there it is. I actually happen to have installed it already, so I'm ready to go. But in case you haven't installed it, make sure that you actually click on the install button, and then it will lead you to a website where you can download the VSIX file. And then from there, simply click on the ellipsis on the marketplace and then install from VSIX. So it's just a different way of installing an extension. So since I've already got this installed, so I'm going to launch the book right away using the Control-Shift-P shortcut, and then type in SQL Server Diagnostic Book. So there is a Launch Book SQL Server Diagnostic Book option. When I do that, it will launch or open the Jupyter Book related to the SQL Server Diagnostic Book. So if I just minimize some of this, so you can see there are collections of notebooks organized in a nice way. So for example, the first one is Glenn Berry's diagnostic scripts, and then SP who is active, SQL assessment API, etc. Now, one of the key advantage of using Notebook as well as Jupyter Book is once you have this organized, say if I'm new to this Jupyter Book and I'm looking for Azure SQL or any notebooks related to Azure SQL, I can start typing in here on the search bar, Azure SQL, and then it will start loading the Azure SQL related notebooks. So as an example, maybe I'll choose this one here, which has got about 13 hits, right? So when I click on that, it will start launching it. This happens to be one that is created by Glenn Berry. So very useful. And then from here, I can check out all the steps to get the SQL and OS information and expand the script as an example, etc. So very, very handy. In case you're super inspired with what you've seen so far and you want to create your own Jupyter Book, it's actually also pretty straightforward for you here. In a folder or subfolders even, where you have a lot of notebooks and you want to organize them into Jupyter Book so that it will show really nicely on the notebooks viewer like this, there is a feature, it's a preview feature on the notebooks viewer. So if you click on the ellipsis here, there is a create book preview. So this is a notebook to create a Jupyter Book based on the folder or the path where you have the notebook collection. Simply follow this interactive notebook to create a Jupyter Book, and at the end, you will get a Jupyter Book. Okay, so you've seen notebooks in Azure Data Studio from just creating a notebook itself, exporting from SQL scripts to notebooks, as well as creating a Jupyter Book. Now, what if there is a way for you to learn new features or deploy something new? Well, there is. That's a good news. So from the connections viewer, there is an ellipsis here where you can click on new deployment. There are several different options. So for example, if you're new to SQL Server container-based, so new to Docker and everything else, once you have Docker installed and then you click on this, and then it will ask you to go to the next steps, etc., and then it will start building the notebook for you to create a SQL Server container inside your Docker. So for now, I'm going to select a deployment using Azure SQL Database. So in the next few steps, I'm simply providing details that are required of me to create a database inside Azure SQL Server. So there are a number of resource types that you can choose from: single database, elastic pool, or the database server itself. For now, I'm just going to create a single database and then go through the next steps. So once I confirm the details of the SQL database that I wanted to create, it's going to produce this nice notebook where essentially, especially if this is a database that I want to build up and tear down, maybe for demo purposes or something else, I can save this notebook and rerun it, and it will create the database. So just a quick note here, just as a reminder. The steps that I showed you earlier on the UI is only showing, or is only creating a notebook to create a SQL database. So it doesn't do that immediately. So if you want to create it, just simply run all, and then it will just run all the steps. Okay, to summarize, these are the notebook experiences in Azure Data Studio. We first started with collaboration. So for example, writing a notebook that you can share with others, whether it's for reporting, data visualization, or perhaps it's something related to data workflows, so for example, data science or data engineering. So if you're a data scientist, then you can also use this Jupyter Notebook, similar to what you normally would use with Jupyter Notebook. And then you can also use the notebook experiences in Azure Data Studio as a UX or user experience in learning new things, or perhaps in deployment or troubleshooting, feature discovery. Notebooks are also very useful for documentation, like I've mentioned or showed you earlier, especially if you're teaching somebody. Notebooks are a great way to do that. And lastly, and this is where actually perhaps in the next installment, whether it's Scottish Summit or my other future presentations, I'm hoping to talk a little bit more about the operational aspect of notebooks, meaning you can use notebooks for incident response system. All right, lastly, call to action. So install Azure Data Studio. To get to there, you simply go to aka.ms/get Azure Data Studio. And because Azure Data Studio is open source, we actually publish the code as well as issues and everything else on GitHub. So if you go to ak.ms ask Azure Data Studio, that's where the GitHub page is located. And then to make sure that you land the notebook's story or the notebook's journey, I do encourage you to start creating a new notebook, whether it's something small, like maybe perhaps for your, next sort of SQL script that you have to create. Try out using notebooks and see how it goes, and do give us feedback if there are some things that might not meet your standard, or if you have any questions. And to get inspired, it's always good to get inspired, right? Check out other notebooks that are available on GitHub. So I especially recommend the Microsoft Tiger Toolbox notebook, or SQL DBA with a beard, Jupyter Notebooks. And lastly, try using the notebook-based UI, or notebook-based user interface. So earlier I showed you a little bit on the deployment side of it, as well as the Jupyter Book creation. These are some of the references that are available for you. So specifically, I tend to create a session notes for most of my presentations. So one will be available from the bit.ly link there. So essentially, it's my GitHub account, github.com. MS SQL Girl is where I post a lot of my my scripts. And then just a friendly reminder again, use Azure Data Studio, and ak.ms get Azure Data Studio is where you can download Azure Data Studio. And lastly, PowerShell Notebook module. Give that a go. I know a lot of you DBAs are using PowerShell these days. Doug has got a lot of interesting PowerShell commandlets that are added to the PowerShell notebook to make your notebook journey much, much easier and simpler. With that, I'd like to thank you for attending. Give it a go. I love to hear your feedback on your journey with Azure Data Studio Notebooks, and I hope that I'll see more and more notebooks as part of demos in SQL community or data community out there. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.